So cerebral palsy is actually an umbrella term that we use to describe a group of disorders that affect a person's ability to move in a normal way. And cerebral palsy sort of occurs because of damage to the developing brain, maybe caused by an infection or loss of oxygen for some reason. And this damage, it usually occurs during early development, anywhere from in utero to about toddlerhood. And it happens while the brain is still undergoing really critical development. So the damage occurs in parts of the brain that control our movements. And this damage is permanent, but it's not progressive. So the initial damage to the brain, it doesn't worsen over time, but the problems with movements, they do persist for the affected person's entire life. So now that we know a little bit more about cerebral palsy, we can make a bit more sense of the name. So cerebral means brain, so this is where the damage is, and palsy means muscle weakness or loss of function. So this is describing the main problem that arises from this damage in the brain. So let's highlight the general parts of the brain here that are involved in movement. So these will typically be the areas that get damaged to cause cerebral palsy. So we've got the cerebellum and the motor cortex. These are the two bits that we can see looking at the brain from the outside. And then if we go a little bit deeper inside the core of the brain, we've got the basal ganglia. So these parts of our brain, we can think of them as our movement centers. And what they're involved in are things like helping us make movements. So they help us coordinate and move our arms and our legs and our torsos, but they also help us to maintain our balance and control our posture and our muscle tone and our reflexes. So it kind of follows that when either of these movement centers themselves or the tracts of neurons that they use to communicate with each other and our muscles, when any of these are damaged during development, the person will develop problems with their movements, and that's what we call cerebral palsy. So one of the interesting issues with cerebral palsy is that the amount of trouble that each person has with their movements can vary a lot between different people. So let's explore this a little bit further. Let's draw a severity spectrum here for cerebral palsy. So the further to the right we go, the more trouble the person has with their movements. So on our left here, on the mild end of our spectrum, we'll have people who aren't too badly affected from a sort of functional day-to-day point of view. So this little boy here, it looks like he's able to walk and run around pretty well. And we know that cerebral palsy can cause trouble with posture and balance and coordination. So because this boy is able to run around like this, we would say that he's not too severely affected. His form of cerebral palsy is quite mild. He'll still have some movement problems. Maybe he can't run quite as fast as someone without cerebral palsy, or maybe he has some trouble with coordination. So maybe something like running and throwing a ball at the same time. But overall, he's able to function pretty well on a day-to-day basis. But if we head over here to the severe end of our spectrum, the picture looks quite different. So this girl here also has cerebral palsy, but instead of being able to run around, she needs to be in a wheelchair. And it looks like she's having trouble with her posture, so she needs to be held upright. And you know, her cerebral palsy is so severe that she can't really get around by herself in her chair. It looks like she needs someone to operate it for her. So let's actually relabel the ends of our spectrum here so that we're painting a better picture of how wide this range of movement problems really is in cerebral palsy. So let's say that the severity spectrum for cerebral palsy goes from running to wheelchair and everything in between. So this gives us a pretty good idea of how wide that range of movement problems can be. So what we're actually looking at here is something called the Gross Motor Function Classification System, or the GMFCS. And each of these pictures here actually represents the different levels of the GMFCS. So this system is a really useful way for characterizing the severity of someone's cerebral palsy. It gives us a good, fairly standard way to get an idea of a person's movement abilities or their movement impairments. So let's leave this for a moment and go back to those damaging events that I mentioned, the events that damage the movement centers during development and cause.
Berdasarkan Badan Pusat Statistik pada tahun 2019, terdapat 17 juta penderita cerebral palsy yang tersebar di seluruh dunia. Menurut hasil penelitian epidemiologi Trisnawianto dan Purnawanto 2019 mengenai cerebral palsy di klinik Kitty Center selama 5 tahun, didapatkan bahwa cerebral palsy lebih banyak terjadi pada anak laki-laki dibanding anak perempuan. Namun, alasan klinis dari kejadian tersebut belum diketahui secara pasti. Ibu menyadari bahwa adanya keterlambatan perkembangan pada bayi sejak umur 1 bulan. Bayi tidak pernah menangis sejak lahir hingga kini. Proses persalinan dilakukan secara normal, dan bayi mengalami kritis selama 2 hari serta koma 7 hari. Dokter mengatakan bahwa bayi mengalami infeksi air ketuban. Selama kehamilan, janin yang dikandung sehat. Kata dokter, Arka mengalami ensepalon dan cerebral palsy. Pertumbuhannya cukup baik, namun perkembangannya seperti bayi 1 bulan. Kekuatan mengisap dot Arka kurang sehingga lebih sering dibantu menggunakan sendok. Arka juga belum melakukan empasi.
Sekarang teknik kedua yang kita harus lakukan adalah stimulasi kecil.
Aku video kita dari sini.
Dia bisa merasakan, tapi tidak mampu mengeluarkan sampai dia menangis.
Dengar aku dulu. Terapi di kota tuh lebih enak dapat terapi di desa.
Siapa kamu dibawa di desa ini?
Iya.